So Eric is going to tell us all about Dan and Co. and how they got on with the solar system and beyond.
In the solar system.
Wow. Right, thank you very much.
I think I'll correct that. I'm not going to tell you all about anything. I felt terribly sorry for Dan. I don't know if you noticed, but during lunchtime he was staring expectantly at the screen, and then as soon as we started talking he was facing in that direction. So
we took some photographs in between time.
Good. The Eagle was packed with amazing things. So it seems in some ways invidious to pick and choose. And yet it is absolutely clear that for so many people, the Eagle means Dan Dare, and Dan Dare means Frank Hampson. And that's certainly what the thread that I'm going to attempt to look at today. I want to look at the worlds that they visited in the stories in sequence and see how believable they are, and en route, as it were, to pick out some of the social elements which the future was thought to hold in the stories. I should give you a word of warning here. My credentials for talking about the astronomy of the solar system are almost non-existent. And the almost I can only claim because when I was a Boy Scout I got my astronomer's badge. But I can say I got my astronomer's badge because the interest that was kindled by reading Eagle. So, as I said, do be warned. Well, we've already heard, I think it was Jerry made the point, or Will, that it didn't make sense to start the stories with the Moon or Mars because they were so well known. Frank was obviously interested in complex societies, complex alien societies, and you couldn't just dump one of those on Mars or the Moon and pretend that it would work. People would be too disbelieving. So you go to Venus, shrouded in mystery, first satellite going there, I think, in 1962, and known to be very hot, but this is a place where we can manage it, possibly. Now, where am I? Sorry, I need to get my glasses out to make sure I'm doing the right one. It should be it. Yes, so in order to pick up that theme of heat, we have the flame belt, and it has a social purpose in separating the Trines in the north from the Theorons in the south, and it also has an inhabitant, the silicon mass. And perhaps this is the right moment just to get something out of the way, and that is the aliens themselves, the Trines, the Theorons, and so on. They are, of course, completely unbelievable. Inhabitants of uninhabitable worlds, or at least uninhabitable for them, maybe for the silicon mass, but nothing else. And I think this is simply a narrative requirement. If you're going to have a boy's adventure story set in space, you have to have interaction. And this, of course, is the other, even more unbelievable thing. Not only do you have aliens on these uninhabitable worlds, they breathe the same air as human beings, they eat food which will do for both, all of this sort of thing. You just have to suspend your disbelief. When I think about air, I just think to myself, you can't, there may be people here who can do it, but I can't imagine drawing convincingly, punching somebody who's wearing a spacesuit. So do away with the spacesuits and just have them in front of you. So I think once you get beyond that, I find that a lot of what Frank Hampson portrays is attempting to be accurate. And I think that fitted with Eagle's ethos. So here we have Venus, and of course, as has already been pointed out, where am I? Mekonta, where I believe some people may be going for a drink later this evening, if I remember the program. I think that, and Jim Burns mentioned a couple of parallels, I think that Frank had a great interest in architecture. And if you're interested in alien societies, you have architecture. I mean, look at that as an image. This is not background. It is precise. It is planned. And the number of different buildings, each of them with its own function, and so on, and so on, and so forth. I find this one of the most gripping illustrations in Frank Hampson's oeuvre. And it also gives me an entree if I can provide some extra information to what Jim Burns said. And I have a slide which is almost identical to his. It is about Frank's involvement with modernism, international modernism. When one says international modernism in 1950, this is what Frank did with buildings like, in the 1930s you have the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill. At the time that Frank was drawing, around 1950, you have the Royal Festival Hall. This is what I would call first phase modernism, in which there's a stress on concrete, plain surfaces, glass is used for windows, exactly as you see in this building here in the first issue. And there, jumping into the Red Moon Mystery, Fleet Street, in 1999. So what Frank is doing here is he's right up to the minute, and he's using that knowledge of up-to-the-minute architecture to provide the basis for future buildings on Earth. As such, he is simply a well-informed individual. When you look at Mekonta, then, let me go back to it just for a moment. When you look at Mekonta, it has nothing in common with international modernism as I have described it at Bexhill and the Royal Festival Hall and Dennis Lasden's buildings, for example. But it is related to what I would call second phase modernism. And here it becomes rather, I would even say, prophetic, if that's the right word. Certainly something to take notice of, because let me give you an example. Second phase modernism you can find earliest on in Archigram. I'm sorry about this blockage. Peter Cook's Archigram in the 1960s with his walking cities, which strike me as having quite a lot in common with Mekonta. However, this is pure fantasy. It's just like Dandere. This is not architecture as one knows it. They didn't build anything. I think Peter Cook built a building in the 1980s or something like that, one building. You have to go into the 1970s and early 1980s to find standing examples of what I've called second phase modernism, like the Pompidou Centre, for example, or the Lloyd's building, Richard Rogers, as you can see here with the interior. And I don't think I have to analyze these images. It seems to me that the person who designed that could well have, even if it's only a lost memory, could well have had a memory of Mekonta when he was designing it. And I think I jumped a slide there. Yes, there's the exterior of the Lloyd's building. We have moved over from concrete and planar surfaces to metal and curved surfaces. And if you want means of describing Mekonta, it seems to me that those fit. Similarly, with Norman Foster, and if I go on to the next one, that's what I meant by following what Jim Burns said. Now, and I'm showing a detail of Mekonta here, and it does seem to me that pylon, if you like, in that dramatic cover, early in Volume 2, really does look like the sort of thing that Norman Foster had in mind. What did these architects say? Some of them made some remarks about the eagle. Peter Cook said, "I have no interest in either the eagle or Dandere." Well, I wonder, I really do. Maybe he'd forgotten. I know nothing about what Richard Rogers thinks, but I was very interested in Will mentioning Norman Foster, because he does now say, I was influenced by Dandere. Interestingly enough, he didn't always say it, because early on he acknowledged that he had read The Eagle as a boy, and that it had influenced him. When he was building the Sainsbury Centre at the University of East Anglia, I was on the staff there, and I had a chance to talk to him. And of course, I was very interested in his reply, what his reply was going to be, because I said to him, "You were influenced by the Eagle. You read it. You were influenced by it. But by what in particular? Anything in particular?" Assuming he would say Dandere. he said Ashwell Wood's exploded drawings on the centre spreads. Now, Ashwell Wood's drawings are absolutely magnificent, and if you're an architect, they can be extremely useful to you in developing your interest in what you want to be. But by definition, they are to do with exposition, clarity, construction, that sort of thing. They're not to do with architectural creativity. So I said to him, what about Dan Dare? Oh, no, absolutely not. He just denied it. And that was early in his career. Later, I think it was in the 80s or something like that, somebody else asked him, and he said, oh, yes, Dan Dare was important. And I would like to think that this is simply that as he became more confident, he could say, I found a comic of value in my work. And what this amounts up to for me is that I think that Frank Hampson deserves a place, a mention, possibly more than a mention, in any history of modernist architecture in Britain. It's not my period, so I can't be sure about saying this, but I don't believe that he is mentioned in most surveys or accounts of modernism in Britain. And on the basis of parallels like that and the preceding one with the Lloyd's building, I think there must be something there. So the next thing that I want to look at, sticking to the Venus story, is historic events in the Venus story. Now, obviously the most historic was them getting there, people on Venus. There are two others, however, which I'd like to pick out. And the first is this one. The first pitched battle fought in space. And that's what the text says up there on the top row of the illustration. Of course, Frank is taking it as understood that the first pitched battle fought in space in human history. Who knows what was going on at Proxima Centauri and beyond. But look at it. I mean, talk about a page of action which doesn't have any movement. It's almost impossible to believe that the page doesn't move. And yet, there it is. I showed this to a friend of mine who knows nothing about Dan Dare and the Eagle. And they said, good heavens, Star Wars. And of course there is something of Star Wars there, but we have to be careful. This is Frank has no part to play in Star Wars, because that's the third corner of the triangle, which has again been mentioned, and that is America. Because I am pretty sure that Frank must have known of some American comic strip techniques and approaches to produce the sort of imagery that you see there. That's one of them. The second one is, of course, the defeat of the Trines, and the fact that the Trines, they surrender, and their surrender is formally taken, which should be here. What is significant about this is obviously that the Trines are brought into civilized discourse with the rest of along with the Theorons. But there is something else about this surrender, which is a historically significant event, not in 1996, 95, 96, when this would have taken place, anyway, shortly after 1995, but in 1951, when it was drawn. The reason why I say that is that the person, you can only just make it out here, and I think you have to know it before you can recognize it. The person taking the surrender on behalf of Earth and on behalf of the Theorons just happens to be black. Now, as I say, you can't see it there, but if you go back to the launching... excuse me.
Yes, he's brought that one over especially for us.
Oh, lovely. Thanks a lot. Just let me take a sip. If you go back to the setting out of the expedition from Earth, this is what you see. And now this has been mentioned, and one shouldn't slide over it. And that is that there are moments in the Dan Dare strip where you can see a kind of casual prejudice. I give you, for example, the people who start the riot on the satellite in the Red Moon mystery. They are an Arab and a black guy in a zoot suit. And the people who try to keep their heads level and talk them out of it are a pucker British gent and an American teenager, which is, pretty obvious. But that's, along the edge. This is headline anti-racism. And I was absolutely delighted, as you can imagine, when in 1978 I came across this in a newspaper. It's a report, and I apologize for the quality of the scan, but I did find it in 1978. It's a UN peacekeeping force in the Middle East. The commander is a Ghanaian, and his second in command is a French colonel. It is identical to what you have in Dander in 1951. Right, well, let me then move on to the Red Moon mystery. And of course, the first thing one's got to say about it in terms of astronomical accuracy is it ain't a moon. What is it? It's an asteroid. And why, if it's an asteroid, does it look like that? And here we move into the realms of the fantastic, not quite as fantastic as the Trines and Theorons living on Venus, but space bees who have accidentally inhabited this asteroid and burrowed it in order to survive, creating the clouds of dust which give it this red moon aspect. However, when you get down to the surface, I must say, having seen these pictures that Rosetta sent back, and even earlier approaches to asteroids 2001 and so on, I find it quite accurate. Now, there is a date for the moon mystery, and that is 1999. The earliest, as far as I know, well, certainly Shoemaker is 2001. So on that basis, I would say we're just managing to keep up with Space Fleet in terms of the passage of time. And then this sets the whole story in place. And if you're a boy reading the comic, it gives you an astronomical layer. You've got the orbit of Mars, you've got the path of the red moon, which then diverts into orbit around Mars, you've got the space station, and then you've got all the spacecraft that are called back to help with the evacuation, and they are limited to a 4-day range. Beyond that, the satellite station will be lost. So I found that one of the most interesting and explanatory images in the story. And then, of course, when they're all upstairs, Dan gets all the evacuees upstairs on the platform, but they are still being drawn in by the red moon's magnetism. What he does is, I'm sure everybody here knows, he shoots the platform off the rest of the satellite, the space station, and that tumbles away to the red moon, and all the evacuees are saved. And this, of course, is the moment where I would like to mention Professor Peabody's contribution, because it seems to me that her contribution to solving the problem of the red moon is the most obvious application of intelligence and problem solving on the biggest scale. She saves the Earth. That's the only way of putting it. And if I go on to the next image, there's this marvellous conversation which takes place in a helijet on a journey to a meeting about what are we going to do about the red moon. And Dan says, as you can see there, Miss Peabody's got a basic idea for a solution, and he is very rude. I've got a basic idea for Professor Peabody as well. And what he's talking about here is that Dan had to rescue her from the red moon. Now, bells should ring there. Rescue her? This is exactly what women are for, to be rescued by the heroes, right? Not a bit of it. I haven't got time to go into the details, but she was on the spacecraft. She was not on the list of evacuees. So when Dan got the all clear and blasted it off, they didn't know that she was still in the satellite. And why was she in the satellite? Because she had gone back to retrieve data. And that data is absolutely central it's to do with reading off the movement of chlorophyll from the colonies on Mars to the red moon. And this gives Jocelyn the idea that what they need to do in order to stop the red moon attacking Earth is to trail another tastier planet in front of it. if you see what I mean. And this is the page in which this... I have never seen a page in a comic with so many speech bubbles and so many words in each of the speech bubbles. It really goes into detail, and Sir Hubert remains a misogynist to the end, or at least the end of the page. The basic thing is that she says, trail another tastier planet in front of it. And he says, what? Trail a planet? Why not the sun? You're raving mad, woman. And she says, oh, you don't need a planet? Then what about a tank of concentrated chlorophyll? And it's Dan who says, hang on, we don't need the chlorophyll any more than we need the actual planet. We just need the light, because that's what the space bees are relying on. They build the light, they decoy, the light acts as a decoy, and they trail the space bees asteroid away from Earth towards the sun, where they're hoping to destroy it with the aid of Sondar and his fellow Trines. And that's where you see them destroying it. They are overly successful, and the explosion engulfs them when they crash onto Mercury, and we move on to the next story. That is again a paper with a date on it, 1999. So we moved on 4 years from the Venus story. And then, now, because I think the Marooned on Mercury is a marvellous story, by the way, also has various aspects of it in which, Jocelyn Peabody learns the Mercurians' language, for example. That's another piece of realism. But I don't want to talk about it because it is not Frank's work. And so I'm just going to say that. And I suppose one thing I can say about how can you have anything living on Mercury? In the 1950s, and I hope I've got this right, it was understood that Mercury had the same period of rotation as it had of revolution. And therefore, like the moon, it kept its face to the parent body permanently. So you had one side which was absolutely ablaze, and the other side which was as cold as could be, which meant that you could have a temperate zone in between. And that is where the Mercurians lived, and where the adventures, mostly anyway, take place. But on then to the next one. Frank's back. I keep calling him Dan. Frank's back. And here is that marvellous car scene, which has also been referred to, where Hank is taking part. They are going very fast through Space Fleet headquarters. Hank says, yeah, ride him, cowboy. Pierre is not so happy. Please, take it easy. It will not fly. It is only a car. And Dan says, only a car? You're speaking of the Aeronjet Super Sport Aqua Gyro that I love. And then Pierre says, Digby, more slow. And he says, no good talking to me, as again was mentioned. It's Colonel Dan's foot on the accelerator. I'm only steering. Now, this is pure Top Gearery. And I do wonder if Jeremy Clarkson in 1970, when he was 10, didn't come across some back issues of the Eagle. Anyway, we go into the Venus story, and immediately we're confronted with science. We have the 9 moons laid out for us. I can no longer say the 9 moons. You've got Phoebe there, which I understand has been demoted. But of the time, it is as it would have been understood. And all of them are named. That's unnecessary, in fact, because only 3 of them are used. But that's not the point. You are here introduced to Saturn and its moons. And the 3 that are part of the story, Phoebe, Titan and Mimas, that is the outermost, the biggest and the innermost, play those parts, as it were, correctly in the story. Now, as far as the date is concerned, we've got Cassini, a report of Cassini, down here on the right. I think that was 2004. Now, just think about it. 1995, 1999, off to Saturn sometime after 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002. At no point, as far as I've come across anyway, after the Red Moon, does Frank provide a date. And there is one paper in one of the subsequent stories. I thought, Daily World Post, we've got a date. You know what it says? Date as postmark. I could have punched it. I really could. And I think the reason for this is that if you're writing in 1952 or 1953, whatever it is, saying something is beyond the year 2000, it just puts it so far in the future, because what we tend to do is, we're in the third millennium, so anywhere up to 2999. It's like this business of only £2.99. Advertisers seem to think, and I think they're right, that we see this as anywhere from £2 to £2.99. And if you say £3, that means anywhere from £3 to £3.99. So I think he was probably onto something. It would make it too alien, too distant. Anyway, here's our alien talking about that. Thal, the leader of the rebels, and there is his hidden city on Phoebe. And the people he's fighting against are people just like him. These are the aristocrats, the Rutha, and their ruler, Vora. And how do they manage to keep control? Well, again, they've been mentioned. These marvellous objects, the Krupaks, the black cats, and that again is one of the most sinister, I think, images that I know of or remember from the Dan Dare stories. And I think what I'd like to do at this point is to offer a comparison. The lion has been mentioned, but there is Captain Condor with something similar, alien machines. And of course, I don't want to be I got a lot of fun out of Lion myself at the time in the 1950s, so I'm not knocking it as a comic, but in comparison with what Hampson did in The Eagle, it just doesn't stand up. In fact, it's almost like a cartoon, not a comic, but a cartoon, a joke, as it were. Nothing has the weight that the Hampson work does. And of course, one has to say, there is an economic reason for this. You've got that threepence up there. If you could see the Eagle panel, you'd see the Eagle was fourpence halfpenny. That's 50% more money to play around with. You can buy better paper, you can buy better paints, you can employ better artists, and so on. And of course, the Eagle was the broadsheet to the Lion's tabloid. But there it is. The next story is Prisoners of Space. And I know people who really like Prisoners of Space. I'm not going to talk about it, exclusively really, because it's not Frank Hampson. But I also think it is a weak story, weakly drawn and written. In fact, I see it, I'm afraid, as a sort of Brian Ricks farce in a space station. But on to The Man from Nowhere. Dan is back, Frank is back, and here you see Lero, who's come from Kryptos to plead with the people from Earth to come and help them fight. They don't know how to fight. They're a completely pacifist people. They want Earth's help to protect them against the Fants, who are the opposite and very warlike. And so they agree to go, and this story leads into Rogue Planet. And there you see them arriving at the sun system of both of these planets, the three suns of Los. So you know we are definitely in interstellar space. There they are. And then here is the capital city of Lero's civilization, Kryptosian civilization. Now, we've got another city here, and I'd like to just say, consider it in terms of what I said earlier about architecture. I drew a distinction between the two phases of modernism, concrete, early modernism, if you like, and then something more metallic and curved, cylindrical of second phase modernism. This is neither, and I would argue that this is not Frank acting as it were as an architect. I think what Frank is doing here is expressing the culture of the crypts. This is, as I said, a peaceful culture. And look at it. I mean, the whole thing about it is gentle curves, nothing angular, etc. And if you then follow them into the landscape and you look at that house, gentle cylinder with moulded edges, the windows surrounded by moulded borders, the boat, exactly the same way. And let me just give you one more example. If I take you back to that shot of Lero, but include, and we've seen him too. What I'm referring to is the Navigator. He's wearing earphones which belong in the same stylistic category as the spaceship, the house, and the boat. I put this almost on the level of anthropology, you know, looking at the character of a civilization and attempting to represent it visually. Well, I don't want to go on, obviously I don't have the time to go on any further through the story. So what I've done instead is I've given you a list of the stories up to Operation Earthsaver. And there are just a couple of things that I wanted to point out from this. And again, one of them has been mentioned, and that is Trip to Trouble, where you see that line just above it. This is the point, very crudely put, where Dan leaves, not just for one story, but leaves, and Frank Bellamy takes over. And we've already seen this slide, in fact, that one. And I would just say my position on Frank Bellamy is that he is one of the few artists who could have succeeded Frank Hampson. He is fantastic, and I think it's putting the question the wrong way to say, why wasn't he more like a continuation of Frank Hampson? So there you have the power of Frank Bellamy. And there's something else about that which I'd like to note, and that is, I think it's a Trip to Trouble, the one that you were looking at. We haven't got it on the screen with the, what's his name, or have we? Yes, you won't be able to make it out. The thing about this is very relevant to today. It's 2nd of January. This is the first year in which the first number of the volume was moved from the middle of April to the beginning of January. So it's a epoch-making. Numerologically, it's horrendous, as it were. So I've just got 2 more slides. I go back to this, and what the reason why I put in why I stopped at Operation Earthsaver is because that's the point. Again, this was mentioned when Dan is put inside again, you know, like that. And I want to end with this, which is the point, the Safari in Space, Terra Nova pair of stories, and that's where Digby is being kidnapped with the aid of I presume an electronic digital paralyzing pistol as opposed to the old-fashioned water-based ones. The gang that captured them, I don't know if you can make it out, but they have got a tattoo on the back of their hand. And the place they're going to, of course, you know the story, Terra Nova. It says, add Terra Nova. Apparently, Hulton Press was nearly inundated, drowned by the numbers of letters that just poured in. Ad takes the accusative. It should be ad Terra Novam. So, on the basis of that. And my last slide is again one we've seen before. I think this is, again, a marvellous image. This is, although it's been done a generation before as well, by McHugh's father, this is the Earthmen or the Earth scientists getting it together and going to the stars under their own power. And I just think that decade of Frank Hampson's work, 1950 to 1959, what a decade for the British comic strip. Yes. Thank you.
There we go. I think there'll be a couple.
Thank you, Eric, as always. Fantastic, thank you. There's just one comment you made about the no dates. The only other date I can remember is when they return in Reign of the Robots. They go into the inner sanctum, and there's Sir Hubert's bust with 2009 graffitied across it.
Thank you. So we have got something in the noughties.
At the end of Operation Saturn, it mentions 2001. I'm trying to remember.
I'll look it up anyway.
Yep.
Thank you.
It's in one of the boxes.
Still a good point, though. Still a good point.
Yes, that data's postmark still stands.
I noted that as well.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, one at the back.
I'm just going to follow up on that date. The scribbled number on the bust in dust was 2002, but on the teletext, which was nearby, they referred to invasion force and everything, and they worked back from how long they'd been away. That particular year was 2011, but it was 2002 when the invasion was.
Any other questions before we move on? Think. Oh yes, one more from John. There you go.
This is more of an observation or a speculation. It's been fascinating to listen to your reflections on architecture and in the various planets and places where the Dan Day adventures took place. And has been reflected on by other speakers today. We're now possibly moving into an era where Britain is going to there's more commercial space flight. And although I understand from Alan Bond there may be a retrenchment on the government's part in supporting things like an spaceport programme in Britain, of course, one point, as a Scotsman, I'm rather pleased by the fact that the best candidate sites for a future British spaceport are Scotland. I one just down the road from where I live and we fly rockets. But what I was wondering is, they've got the spaceport in New Mexico where Virgin Galactic are hoping to eventually operate on somewhere with a passenger carrying basis, and that's a very curved, flowing design. It's a spaceport designed entirely for peaceful operations. So it'll be very interesting, maybe 50 years from now, if Dan Day is revisited, and there's a speaker then who has the same perceptions as you have. By that time, perhaps, there will be a couple of British spaceports and vehicles like Skylon and others operating from there. Right. But at the moment, though the British National Space Agency published some speculative drawings of what British spaceport would look like. But of course, once you sit down to design one operationally, it will probably be a very different matter. We're not going to have these glorious launch ramps and control towers parked right next to the launch site as we had down there. But it would be interesting to see how the architectures of reusable spacecraft and the architecture of the places they operate from will work together in the future, and how that might be read back to the architectural considerations you've invited us to look at this afternoon.
I agree. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I remember reading that the candidates for the sites of the new spaceport, which is going to be being built in 2019 or something like that, are in Cornwall, North Wales, Glasgow, the Hebrides, and somewhere else. And when I read it, I just said to myself, how could they miss out Southport?
We didn't. We got overruled.
Here he is. We've got the expert in the audience. That's the problem. Too many experts around here. Yes. Right. Well, thank you very much. That was excellent. We'll look forward to hearing more about